Okay, it's the day before the Heaney exam, and we are going to look at Westering, the poem, okay? First thing to look at is 1970. Heaney is a small little country boy. He's not a small boy, but from a small little country town, as you know. And he's just visited Berkeley in California. Now, this has an enormous kind of effect on his consciousness. But it's really interesting in a famous interview with a famous literary critic called Patricia Beer. She complains and says, you couldn't write about America. And I think that's one of the ways of actually looking at this poem. I think this poem shows the kind of desperation to get away from Ireland and the captivation with this idea of exile. But the reality of it is that he finds himself almost reluctantly drawn back to Ireland. So he has failed as a poet in exile. So many of the Romantic poets like Shelley, Keats and Byron all went away to the continent. They put themselves in exile from England. But here, Heaney's attempt at exile seems to be a complete failure. Now, Ella and I were speaking a moment ago about what poetry lines mean. And once again, I'm going to say the same thing, that this is a poem of ambiguity. And when you encounter ambiguity, rather than thinking, oh God, what does this actually mean? I would recommend that you play with different readings and play with meaning. So let's have a little look at this, okay? First of all, the poem is called Westering, and the most obvious thing is it's not about the West. It's a poem about Donegal, it's a poem about Ireland and the Irish context and Irish history. It also seems to be almost in the form of a prayer, as I'll go on to explain now. So it begins with the moon, Rand McNally's moon, which was the most famous poster of the moon, with the moon in a great deal of detail, with all of the little craters showing. And what Heaney does is he uses a metaphysical conceit. Now you may remember from poetry that the metaphysicals love to compare unlikely things. For instance, Donne compares compass to his mistress's legs, for instance. And so we call this metaphysical wit when you have an incredibly surprising simile. Here we have the moon going to frog skin. And of course this map was green with some blue in it, okay? So immediately you have this incredibly striking simile. What's the effect of it? Why do we think he used it? Well, if I'm to speculate, I think it's almost like here he is in the United States, but he might as well be on the moon. And I think that this is all part of this idea of being a lost, as I say here, total man, lost, unhappy, and at home. This time, he seems lost, unhappy, and in exile, doesn't he? He seems to be away from home. We have the idea of the colour green as being almost alien-like. This kind of frog land makes it seem as though in the present, in California, he seems distracted. Now, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because Berkeley, California would be one of the most desirable places to be. It would be where Irish people, British people might dream of going because of its reputation for its coastline, its sunshine, it's the Orange State and all of these kind of things. But ironically, Heaney just doesn't seem to be at home there at all. And immediately, rather than writing about it, he's going to switch to Ireland, isn't he? If we go into the second stanza, notice there's Jamon, open, and one called Pitiscus at eye level. Now it's interesting, isn't it? This very famous crater he looks at the image, and what does he do? He shifts from the literal to home. So this place on the moon reminds him of Donegal. Notice here the Caesura, and then this is where the Volta is. We switch from the poster of the moon, almost without any kind of warning, to Donegal. So he remembers the last night. Well, why is he thinking about this last night? It's had an enormous impression upon him. And this is very much a stream of consciousness poem, where he veers from one subject to the next. as these things remind him and have very complex associations, okay? Notice here he says, the reason why it reminds him is, my shadow neat upon the whitewash from her bonny shine. So he's thinking of the moon in this picture, and that somehow forms a parallel with the moon that he sees in this cobble yard, isn't it, okay? And so it switches him from these two different images over here, and he begins to think about the cobbles on the yard, and he begins to think that they're lit as pale as eggs. And this, now, you'll see that there's an end stop there. If we switch onto the full stanza, what do we see? Summer had been a free fall. So he recollects the moments before this, ending there. What does he mean by a free fall? We can only sort of speculate. To me, it sounds as though this enormous move was disorientating for him, as though he's falling, as though he has some kind of vertigo. And then it says, ending there. Now, you'll notice again, it's about omissions. What's omitted? Anything to do with the United States. So again, we're left with the paradox, aren't we, of the title being Westering. And when we conjure up images of the West, we think about, like the Great Gatsby, we think about the frontier, we think about opportunities and everything, and yet Heaney chooses not to write about it at all. Instead, he says, the empty amphitheatre of the West. Well, why does he describe it in that way? Well, we know that often he describes Ireland as the opposite. He describes Ireland as claustrophobic, with a low sky. He describes the fenced land, apart from the bogland, doesn't he? He talks about the fact that you have the weight of history and these cycles of violence all of the time. When the few times that he writes about the United States, and it's always indirectly, it's always in terms of space. But notice this time, if we use the term space, that can sound positive. If we use the term empty, that can usually sound very negative, doesn't it? So even though Ireland has all of this trouble, one thing that it doesn't have is emptiness. It seems to be rich and packed with meaning and with history. And again, notice, when we in the stanza here, it's end stopped. But Heaney doesn't choose to start Good Friday in this stanza. He could have put it into the fifth stanza. Instead, he cleaves it, and he has this égarement between the two. And that's kind of disorientating. So it's part of that pattern where you have to jump between scene to scene. So the poem itself is quite disorientating, which is why I think it has very much a stream of consciousness kind of structure to it. We had started out past shop blinds drawn on the afternoon. So why is he doing this? Well, we know Good Friday is the time before Easter Sunday, isn't it? We associate it with crucifixion, and we associate the place with Calvary, where Christ is killed. And so we have all of these associations of Jesus, crucifixion, pain, and suffering. Now, whereas the United States is this empty amphitheatre, Ireland seems to be steeped in suffering and to some extent steeped in superstition. By this stage, Heaney has lost his Catholic faith. He seems to be drawn to it and almost miss it, but there are also elements of it that I would suggest seem very negative. He says here, we had started out past the shop blinds drawn on the afternoon, cars stilled, look at the assonance, stilled, outside still, churches tilting, and then wall. So there's a very careful verbal patterning of assonance and consonants here that suggest a kind of quietness. Is this quietness a positive, or is it a country that's frozen in time? I would suggest the latter, to be honest with you. We drove by a dwindling interruption as clappers smacked. So there we have quite an aggressive sound of the bells ringing and of this highly aggressive sound on a bare altar. Now this seems to me to be quite bleak and and plain. And I'm going to suggest it almost sounds like a kind of paganism, doesn't it? Look at the congregation bent to the studded crucifix. You know, that sounds to me like superstition. That doesn't sound to me like all about Christ's redemption and things like that. It seems to me like a population in love with a cult of suffering. And that's why he asks, what nails dropped out that hour? And I'll come back to my conversation with Ella earlier. What does that actually mean, that rhetorical question? Does it mean that this is just futile? Does this mean that it doesn't actually produce anything? That the population are on their knees asking for some kind of salvation that's not coming? It's quite hard to say, isn't it? Now, again, notice how there's this shape of the poem where instead of starting a new stanza, he starts the idea in the concluding line of each stanza. And that, again, disorientates it. Roads unreeled with the R's there, falling light as cast laid down. So what do we have? It's almost like a movie as things go by. And this is him leaving Ireland, isn't it? Now, does this seem like regret? To me, it doesn't. It sounds like escapism. It sounds like him looking forward to this California trip, doesn't it? Escaping and getting away from these quiet roads where nothing seems to be happening. He says, falling light as cast lay down. That's a simile from fishing, isn't it? Yeah? And again, it's a very striking simile, very beautiful. It might also be a religious symbol, because like my name is Peter. Peter means fisher of men. Is it another image to this kind of Christ-like idea? It's also a beautiful ocular image, isn't it? On shining waters. Earlier we had the little eggs, didn't we? So we have lots of this kind of beautiful soft lighting idea. And here's the best line of all. Under the moon stigmata. So the moon merges with Christ, isn't it? It's personified as bleeding and having the wounds of Christ. So if we look back very quickly, and we think that the poem begins with the moon, doesn't it? And this kind of alien-like frog skin. Now, the moon in Ireland seems to have the stigmata itself. Now, that seems to me to be a very bleak image of Ireland, isn't it? Ireland bleeding, suffering. And that sort of ends the little, memory bit, and he takes us to the present, doesn't he? 6,000 miles away. And this is where the tone, this is a big volta, isn't it? This is where the tone shifts. I imagine untroubled dust, a loosening gravity, Christ weighing by his hands. So this to me seems the prayer. This seems to me to be the hope, the prayer. But I feel, I don't know about you guys, that there's a bit of a sense of futility in this. I imagine untroubled dust. So he's imagining Ireland, like America, untroubled with all of this violence. But it sounds kind of futile, doesn't it? A loosening gravity. Well, the moon, of course, has a kind of much looser gravity. So there's a kind of clever circularity in it. But it also seems to suggest that Jesus won't be weighed down on the nails in his hands as they rip his flesh. Christ weighing by his hands. What does that seem to me? To me, it seems to me it's a wish that Ireland will no longer be exposed, that Christ, who seems to stand in as a proxy for Ireland, will no longer be exposed to the violence that is shed in his name. So this poem that began with the moon in Berkeley becomes an exploration of being away from home in exile, the impossibility of him to really write about America. Why does he call it Westering instead of the West? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's almost like he attempted to do something and it failed. And of course, after this, he will go back to Ireland. And he only writes about Ireland. It's almost like a kind of revelation that this is his spiritual subject matter, and it ends in this incredibly bleak way. Now, the last thing I'll do, just for a few minutes, is to think about some of the connections that we could make, okay? Well, we could make a connection to Bogland, couldn't we? About the prairies, etc., and this kind of contrast with American space. In Bogland, he finds the space that he seeks by digging down, doesn't he? Here, the space does not appeal to him. It disorientates him and makes him feel completely alien. Now, there are a lot of poems in which he's in Ireland but seems unhappy and lost. Obviously, the key line I have here is in Tollenman, where he says, lost, unhappy, and at home. And you'll recall in Tollenman, what he shows is Jutland and the Norseman human sacrifice